Laura Harrison is with us. What a great honor. Laura is an artist and animator who lives and works in Chicago. Her animations focus on marginalized social outcasts with their own subcultures, and these fringe characters provide a focal point for her concerns with diaspora, transhumanism, gender, and the loss of touch in an overwhelmingly visual world. Her films have screened at numerous film festivals, including the New York Film Festival, the Ottowa International Film Festival, Animafest Zagreb, LA Film Festival, GLAS Animation Festival, the Melbourne International Animation Festival, and many, many others. So it's really a great honor to have you with us. I just want to send a quick shout out and thanks to our friends and co-sponsors who made this series possible: the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry, the Center for Arts and Society, the College of Fine Arts Dean's Office, the Department of Modern Languages, and the Humanities Scholars Program, Ideate, and the Carnegie Mellon School of Art. So without further ado, thank you very much for being here, Laura.
So I just want to give you a sense of who I am, very briefly. You heard a little bit, but I am Laura, and I'm an animator, painter, writer, and sort of all-around artist. And I try to make animations full-time now. I've sort of segued out of painting, which I'll tell you a bit about. This was me during COVID, having a minor nervous breakdown before various screens, trying to keep it together. I think a lot of us kind of like, everything kind of cracked during COVID. So I feel like this is somehow emblematic of my state of mind currently, but also my practice, which is a very, very fragmented hybrid practice, which seems to come together in some sort of whole way, which is slightly miraculous to me. So I'm happy to share with you a little bit of context. So I always like to start with quotes. I think many of us do. It gives you a sense of my framing of my work, and a lot of the people who've influenced my work. I come from a more literary background. I used to work in publishing for many years. And originally, before becoming an animator, I was really interested in performance and writing. So I used to be an actor, actually, when I was a teenager. And then in college, I was studying literature and French for some reason. And so this is Rachel Cusk. Does anybody know who Rachel Cusk is? She's sort of this amazing autofiction. It's like the autofiction industrial complex. I think like it was a big thing over the years where people were just constantly writing about their lives. And I do a lot of coded sort of fictional accounts. I mean, somewhat autobiographical, but then I hinge it to stories that are not mine as a way of trying to tell my own stories in a very indirect way. But Rachel Cusk writes, "Yet it is the masculine values that prevail." This is an important book because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. And Rachel Cusk often writes about kind of like petty encounters or pettinesses that sort of operate between people. They seem like sort of mundane things that become almost violent. I think she's amazing and very, very hard to, like when you go through her trilogy, you just can't stop reading her. And then this is James Baldwin, Nothing Personal. "It is, of course, in the very nature of a myth that those who are its victims and at the same time its perpetrators should, by virtue of these two facts, be rendered unable to examine the myth or even to suspect, much less recognize, that it is a myth that controls and blasts their lives." And then we have Henry Michaud, and this is actually a quote from On Freedom by Maggie Nelson. I know that we're all obsessed with freedom in the United States, and she basically is sort of like, yeah, we don't really have any freedom. And actually, it's not worth it to give up the ability to stay open to other people in order to have freedom. And so there's a whole chapter on drugs and various drug taking. And she quotes Henry Michaud, who's a painter and philosopher writer from the early 20th century. And he says, "To enjoy a drug, one must enjoy being a subject." So hopefully that will help explain some of my points of view in my works that you'll see. And then this is a recent quote that I found actually on Instagram. Sometimes Instagram comes up with really awesome things. And this is Bruno Latour, who is an anthropologist, philosopher. And he writes about like compositionism versus critique and how composition, I'll just read it. "The difference is not moot because what performs a critique cannot also compose. It is really a mundane question of having the right tools for the right job. With a hammer or a sledgehammer in hand, you can do a lot of things: break down walls, destroy idols, ridicule prejudices, but you cannot repair, take care, assemble, reassemble, stitch together. It is no more possible to compose with the paraphernalia of critique than it is to cook with a seesaw. Its limitations are greater still, for the hammer of critique can only prevail if, behind the slowly dismantled wall of appearances, is finally revealed the netherworld of reality. But when there is nothing real to be seen behind this destroyed wall, critique suddenly looks like another call to nihilism. What is the use of poking holes in delusions if nothing more true is revealed beneath? So I've realized like much of my practice is about stitching things together, repairing with different mediums and also different voices, and that my work is about really contingency and how we are reliant on, I'm reliant on other people, but I'm reliant on other modes of working to make sense of what the world is doing around me. So, as we strive to repair ourselves, I've come to the conclusion that we can't really do away with the past, but with compositionism, or the idea of composition, we can embrace the messiness of the mess and while at the same time try to clean it up. So I don't ever actually expect that I can clean anything up, but I do hope that I can at least sort of create a form for it, or an order for us to gain some perspective and to look at it perhaps differently and maybe come up with different solutions for how we deal with our world. In my work, I balance opposing elements, as I said before, with animation styles and materials. My films are an exercise in gathering created and found material through the collage and montage to create a hybrid object. As Robert Bresson says, bring things together that have never yet been brought together and do not seem predisposed to do so. So for example, I really like having parties and inviting people who I'm not sure they will necessarily like each other, just to see what happens. It's sort of an experiment, because I like not knowing what happens. I don't always want to know when I start something the way it's going to end. I think it's boring, and it's like, why bother? You don't need to make anything if that's the case. It's not an inquiry. So I think I mentioned before I was an animator. I worked in publishing, and then I was a full-time painter for 20 years. So this is a painting that's actually sort of towards the end of my painting life, where I was showing in galleries. And in 1997, I left publishing to study painting at the New York Studio School for drawing, painting, and sculpture. And upon graduating, I was painting. It was around 9/11. And I was getting a divorce, and the 9/11 was happening. So I was like, oh, everything's falling apart, both internally and externally. Great. And I don't even know what to paint anymore. I sort of didn't know who I was. I think it happens often in graduate school that people get very disoriented, and it's almost like you lose your homing instinct, like you're a pigeon that just doesn't know which way to go anymore. And I was in a very academic institution where we looked at Matisse and we looked at Cézanne, but we didn't really look around what was happening in Chelsea, and there was so much happening in Chelsea. It was interesting. And the gallery system was sort of booming. So just sort of haphazardly, I landed upon these building portraits, and I realized that I was trying to index and archive buildings that had either been destroyed or renamed in some cases, like the Museum of the American Indian, which I don't have here. I can't find the painting. But it was renamed from the Customs House. And in some cases, the buildings were moved. I think this wall that I painted was actually moved. It's like City College. And then, in Chelsea, at that moment, some of the painters were starting to appear that were really interesting, like Sigmar Polk, who was playing around with the history of optics, I think, in this painting on the top left. Cy Twombly, Gorky was obviously long dead, but still very excited by Gorky. And Dana Frankfurt, who's a great color field painter in the sort of world of Helen Frankenthaler, who's one of my other favorite painters, who I haven't listed here. And then Mark Bradford kind of came out later, around 2006 or so, 2007. He was at the ICA in Boston when I first saw his work. Really excited by it. And it was mapping and coded and mark making and sort of intimate work, but very large scale. And I realized I'm really interested in this idea of intimacy writ large, and that part of what excited me about painting in the first place was that it was intimate, but the gallery system was demanding these larger and larger paintings. So my paintings were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, as in this one, which is giant. It's 12 by 8 feet. And I was getting exhausted, and I was losing this connection to the intimate nature of it. This is Tal R, who I was talking about earlier with Johan, an super interesting painter, Danish-Israeli painter, who I almost quoted his artist talk for this talk today. I was like, oh, maybe I can just use his artist talk because it's so good. But he talks a lot about things about painting that I really found exciting, that I also find exciting in animation, which is you have to have an access point, and that there should be a place inside the painting that is mysterious to you, the painter, but also mysterious to the viewer. So I love that, and I just also like the way he uses space. And I realized I was trying to create these walk-in painting experiences. I went and saw the caves of Ajanta in India. I visited the Valley of the Kings, and I realized talking about hieroglyphs or pictograms kind of has a bad rap, but these were such exciting experiences for me. They transformed my practice and made me want to create a language out of these buildings that I had made. And that came out in this painting here. And then I realized with this form of coded writing, I was trying to connect to myself again through these large-scale works, but also maybe to even write, to tell stories and to move through space. Because writing is, of course, moving through time, and images stop time. And I wanted to do both, which is obviously very greedy. At the same time, I was looking at lots of films that I was enjoying, Cronenberg and De Palma's sisters, a really creepy film about these two sisters, one of whom is psychotic. And then I started learning about Chris Sullivan, who's here, and I saw his film at Ottawa, and I had just started getting into animation around this time. And I realized, oh my God, animation does everything I want. It's painting, it's writing, it's music, it's just everything. It's performance, and I can do this. So I ended up getting a fellowship. But this is also, sorry to backtrack a little bit, this is before creating this language of buildings, I had found this book of cutouts, and I created the language from this, and then they became small codes. But this is also sort of a precursor to frames and images and how the images would speak to each other as in an animation. And then we have, this is from my latest film, Limits of Vision, which actually isn't my latest film, but it's pretty late. And there was this relationship between this codes and language and images that are also language and telling stories and being able to both hold someone in an image and move through it. And I realized I was trying to move through time with the pictograms in the way that I was wanting to do with animation. So I was also making these kind of little graphic novels that turned into films. And just to give you a sense of my practice, I often start with text. So I'm trying to change that now because I realize one can become kind of enslaved to a text. But they were really fun for me because they felt so not heavy or something, even though some of the material was very, very heavy. This is about a woman who gets a facelift that goes badly. And the film itself was a facelift in that I was painting under the camera and then putting it through a digital process. So it literally was a facelifted process. And at that time I was also realizing wow, and this is an animatic. So these are little animatics from these books that I create. But it made me realize that I'm sorry, I just lost track of what I was saying. It's you talk so much that you're wait, what did I want to say? I think what it is that you realize as you're making work that the way it's made directly ties in with what you're trying to say. So that was also kind of a revelation for me. So I think I'll just now show you my first film after the one I made in graduate school, which is the facelift one. And it's called Lingerie Show. And I met my collaborator for this film at MacDowell in 2012, which was a whole other element to my practice. So I had, at this point, I was painting and writing and graphic novels and animation, but I hadn't yet collaborated with anybody. And I got very excited because I'd worked with writers so much when I worked in publishing. So I'm oh, I'm going back to my writing roots, and I'm hanging out with this incredible writer whose chapter I ended up adapting for this film, The Lingerie Show. And the book was actually published 2 years ago. After 10 years, she worked on this book. It's incredible. It's called Fireworks Every Night. But I took one of the chapters from it, and I think I'll play it for you now to give a sense of my earlier work. So that is Lingerie Show. So my animations, this Lingerie Show and Tears for Narcissus and Little Red Giant, the monster that I was, sort of all laid the groundwork for the film that I most recently finished, which I will get to shortly. And it was interesting to go through this sort of process of collaboration in preparation for the latest film, because it was like unbelievable amounts of moving parts. So I was sort of like gearing up to work with other people and to open myself and my process up to a lot of uncertainty. So like, for example, with this film, I worked a bit with the author, but I kind of didn't know, I didn't plan it, I didn't storyboard it, and I didn't really have a lot of people looking at it. I kind of just like, in a fever dream, made it late at night and hoped it would work, and was very surprised by people's very positive response to it. And then with Little Red Giant, which was the next film that came after this, I kind of upped the ante on collaboration in that I wrote half the script, but then realized like it wasn't quite done. And the voice actor who had this incredible voice, I asked them to give me a sense of like when had they had a very negative experience with another woman. And they told this crazy story about being a child with a teacher and the teacher making them destroy all these sculptures. And I thought they'd made it up. I thought it was fiction. And I animated the whole thing and had no idea it was a true story. So this like poor 6-year-old child destroyed like these forever wolves that she had created that were these beautiful sculptures and drawings that ended up appearing in the film. And it was just sort of a strange experience to think something was like fiction when it was true, but also to stitch together my writing with someone else's voice, and that it somehow worked. And it kind of gave me the sense of faith in my process and faith in other people I worked with. I was like, oh, I have good instincts. Like I can trust that I can select really good collaborators who will help this work become strong somehow. And that my intuition is going to lead me to some sort of like form. So this is just a trailer from the film, so you can get a sense. It's a 2D puppet film, and it was on multiplane. Does anybody know what multiplane is? It's just layers of glass, and then you put your background and your puppets on different levels, and it creates a sense of depth. And I just like loved the idea of a crazed puppet show for like a really bad barbecue in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it somehow fit the narrative and the content. It just like formed content. So it was another example of like the form of it actually dovetails perfectly with the writing and the subject, and it creates a kind of content. So here is the trailer for this. I'm not going to play the whole thing because we don't have time. Okay, so one of the other things that was interesting about this experience of this, making of this, was that it was dialogue-based versus voiceover. So all my other films up until that point had been voiceover, and this was like a whole another layer. So like with each work, I just kind of keep layering on new things. I've realized, I'm like, what is that? And what I think it is that I don't want to get mastery, and I am suspicious of it because I think it makes me stiff and incurious. And I see it in other people's works where they start to quote themselves. And so for me, taking on these new techniques or new strategies is a way of constantly opening up my work and keeping it open and keeping it from becoming static. And I think this is also why I felt like I needed to move from painting to this form, because when I worked on a painting for a long period of time, it would inevitably just like tighten up and become weirdly thingified. And so I guess I felt very suspicious of things that felt like things. I wanted it to feel more like experiential. You're in a space, things are happening, you're changing with it. And I wanted it to also feel like it was in some way in dialogue with also the audience, that this is like you're at a party, or you're in the space with people, or it's sort of the opposite of what like Tal R was talking about in his talk that I was watching last night. He talks about entering the painting, and I want people to enter it, but I also want them to feel like the space of the film is expanding out to them. So if I make a painting, I want you to feel like you're in an environment and you're there with it. There's an artist named Olafur Eliasson who did this incredible work at the Tate that was basically like a recreation of the sun. It's amazing. But it was like so inspiring to me, this kind of work, and I'm like, I could never do that. But this is also sort of the intimacy writ large thing where I'm like, I want people to feel like they're going through something. They're going through something with the characters. They're going through something with me, like in the way that I made it. Because I feel like I've gone through things. Every time I make these works, I feel like I change a little. And I'm changed by the making of it, and I like that. Like, I don't want it to stop, even though it's hard, and it feels scary, and it feels like I've lost control all the time. But it's also really exciting for me, and I hope I don't become a coward in my practice. And so, I'm still approaching animation as if I was painting. And when I started the film I'm going to show you next and talk about next, which is The Limits of Vision, I imagine that, like my other films, I would try to create a walk-in painting and a feeling of experience for people, like you're at this person's house. And as I said, I love the idea of intimacy writ large, something that you can step into. But again, it's not comfortable. It's not comfortable for me. It's probably not that comfortable for the viewer. Like, I want you to feel like, okay, Tal R was also saying, like, okay, now we're at the disco, it's party time. And I'm like, yeah, I want you to feel like that, but I also don't want you to be too comfortable and too, like, glib. Like, this is, I still take these people's lives seriously. I take my life seriously. And I think there's something in between. He talks about being irresponsible, and I'm like, well, you can be both. You can be irresponsible in the sense that you're not being dutiful to the work always. Like, you don't have an idea and then you follow it through to the letter. You stay open. But you do also have a responsibility, I think, to your viewer and to yourself not to make something stupid, that's meaningless for someone. Like, I don't, it's not that I think it also has to be like heavy and life transforming, but I want you to walk away with something from these. One of the things that makes it uncomfortable, like I said, is not always knowing what I'm doing. So I'm not like a writer's writer, I'm not a painter's painter, I'm not an animator's animator, but somehow I'm all three at once. And in synthesizing these three art forms, it creates a whole new form, which I'm excited about. And embracing the fragmented aesthetic, I can find some coherence inside works that engage me completely. So The Limits of Vision, in keeping with the impure aesthetic, The Limits of Vision is a hand-painted, destructive, and does anybody know the term destructive animation? I'll show you an example of it, but basically it's you make an image and then you destroy it under the camera. And so you make a really complete-looking image and then you make an adjustment and you animate it constantly so the image never stays. I think it should be called constructive animation because it's both destructive and constructive. And then it also was made with digital animation that I then transferred to 35 millimeter. And the reason I did this because I work in a film program and everybody's fetishizing film constantly and I got sick of it. And I was like, well, I can do that. So I started to like paint and scratch on the film. And because this is also a walk-in painting, I wanted there to be an element of like nostalgia, wishing to enter something. And that film is like nothing if not that for people these days. And it's a very painterly medium. Like I do love film, and I wish I could be more competent and as a 16 millimeter film person. But the 35 millimeter was big enough for me to draw and scratch on it. I then had this after hand painting and scratching it, got redigitized, and then I added, of course, the recorded dialogue. There was probably 7 different parts in this film, so more dialogue. A lot of music, a lot of sound work, and it was like I also had to swap out voices midstream, which was kind of crazy, and it kind of worked. I still don't know how it worked, but I worked on it for like 7 to 8 years. And this is a set from it. I was using some 3D sets and also 3D puppets that I'll show you how that works, which is here. So this is Chris Sullivan's actual patented technique, where he takes a puppet and he holds it up, their head, and he has it moving against a green screen, and then he adds the bodies to it.
Good. Barging into my home and romping about like a pantomime cart horse. Barging into my home and romping about.
So this is not the actual take I used, but I ended up rotoscoping one of these takes, and this is what it...
Barging into my home and romping about like a pantomime cart horse.
Right. So it went from like, a 3D looking thing to a little flatter, and I put it through Photoshop. Sometimes I left it looking 3D just to see what would happen. And then this is when I like took clear leader, and I painted on it with leather dye pens.
About.
Oops.
Good. Barging into my.
I don't want that. I want this one. Sorry. So this is just like, and I got really into this, and I kind of want to do this again, where I painted with leather dye pens on clear leader and then printed them, had them digitized and printed them out frame by frame, and then animated on top of it, and it looks like that over here. So that was some of the techniques that I used. And then I also...
Barging into my home and romping about.
Keeps doing this. Whoops. And this is the coffee animation that I ended up using. So this is not actually a scene that's from the film right now. It's in another draft of the film because I've turned it into a feature, because why not? It's an awkward length. 35 minutes is not the best length for shorts for a film festival, but yeah. So this is with coffee and rotoscoping from actual live action footage. And then these are just sort of stills from the film. This is Mukor. And what was interesting in working on this long form film was that it was a moving target. So as I said before, I really like layering on, piling things on. And some of it I didn't like, because some of it was happening outside in the world. Like the world was sort of piling on. So it was like Trump getting elected, and the Me Too moment, which was exciting but also terrifying, and COVID, which was awful, and Black Lives Matter, which was again like a huge breakthrough, but also, these are all major paradigm shifts in our world. And I felt like my film was changing with the moment. And so just to say again, in my previous films, I was a solo animator with little or no assistance. While with this film, I directed 5 animators, and while the voice and overall hand was still mine, I made all the keyframes, it was augmented by the other animators' hands to complete a work of the scope. My past film's libretto had been mostly voiceover, but Limits of Vision was primarily dialogue that then drifted at times into voiceover. I found myself in the position of directing multiple voice talents and navigating some of those complexities. Many voices were swapped out midstream. The film became larger than myself and took on a life of its own. And then, of course, the world was massively shifting around me. And I had to respect and heed its aesthetic, political, and poetic needs. So again, I never know what's going to happen to a film when I start it, because I don't know what's going to happen in the world. I don't know what's going to happen to me, and I don't know what's going to happen to the people I end up working with, because I have all these variables. But again, I think it can work out really well. So, for example, just to give you a sense of where I was at when I started the film in 2015, I was thinking about second wave white feminism, about its critical flaws, but also the difficulty of breaking free of patriarchy. And I just wanted to sort of show the trickle-down effect of hostility between women because of, patriarchy. And I went to a party and I met the guy who had played, Mukor, who's the god of small things in the film. His name's Gregory Hollyman. He was on Strangers with Candy, and he was this impressive, amazing presence and had one of the best voices ever. And I was like, I want you in my film. And then only later did I consider, the complicated dynamics of this shape-shifting Black spirit and philosophical but antagonistic dialogue with this corporal white woman. And as the implications of Marcia and Mukor's dynamic became obvious, I had to rethink it and felt like I should even call attention to it. And so was looking into white feminism and whiteness generally, and found myself researching texts such as Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, Yag Yassi's Transcendent Kingdom, and Nothing Personal by James Baldwin, who talks all about, like I said in the quote earlier, never attaching, the myths are going to destroy you. And my character in this film that you're going to watch shortly has to let go of a narrative that's hurting her, you know, and in general, all of us as humans have to let go of things that we get attached to. We all have attachments to things that are bad for us, and at some point we have to change, because if we don't, it will kill us. And it's very hard to do, and it's hard in artwork, and it's hard in life. But I realized that that's really what the film is about. So I was also reading The Eyes of the Skin, which is sort of about touch, and using like touch as a sense that's often undervalued culturally. You know, it was always like the bottom of the senses. It was like the last one. And I realized it's so important to me, and it's just not valued. And I was also reading about monstrous architecture and a book called Cruel Optimism and My Grandmother's Hands about embodied trauma, the loss of touch, monstrous spaces, and unhealthy attachments, and how these inform the film. So again, not a pure space. And let's just watch it. It's 35 minutes, but I think we have time, right? We're good for time? Okay. So yeah, so that was the last thing I worked on. And then I did other projects miraculously during this time. So I worked with my other collaborator on the lingerie show, but we made a single mother's baby book together. So it's called Head of Household, and it's all about her experience as a single mother. And we also just figured timing, you know, look, Roe v. Wade just got repealed. There's going to be tons of single mothers, and they need help. And the book was basically like a journaling prompt for journaling. And I did all the illustrations for it, and you know, who knows what will happen to it, but it just got published last year by Princeton University Press. I also did other collaborations with a woman named Lynn Sachs. I made a film, she's a poet, and I gave the images to that, and this was during COVID lockdown. And that was also an interesting experiment. I wouldn't say it was successful in the way that, like, I guess it could be successful, but it's not, it was just more like interesting just to, you know, try different forms of collaboration with different collaborators. And then this is the last collaboration I did, and I'm still sort of working on it. It's a music video, and the band is Bitchin' Bajas, and I worked with this woman, Lily Correa, on it. And I figured like I was the viscera for it, and she's the structure of like the architecture, because there was like so much like stuff happening in it, and she helped kind of form it with me. So we worked on that for, I don't know, only 3 weeks, something like that. I worked on it for 6 months, and then she came in and like helped kind of shape it. And then what's going to happen with this is that it's going to eventually get made into an installation that's going up in September at a place called Media Streams, and it'll totally take a different shape. It's going to be on this architectural wall, an architectural structure that will totally change how it looks, and it will be completely like, and it'll be like a real installation. And we want it to be thematically like the underworld. So we're going to add like Persephone to it, and Hades, and Thanatos, like all the gods of the underworld. And I love the idea that we'd have an underworld in a corporate lobby. I'd be like, surprise, but they won't really know it's hell. And then currently I am working on a novel. And as I worked on the novel, I realized like so much of what I was doing in my animation and also in the book was doubling, and being obsessed with doubles and creating doubles of the culture, but also of myself, and realizing that there's certain things I couldn't own about myself that I was trying to sort of sort through in my films. And I ended up reading this great book called Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. Does anybody know this book? Yeah. And so you know that Naomi Wolf is her doppelganger, and she keeps getting confused with this woman who's an anti-vaxxer and is like publishing things that are very similar in tone, but just completely different facts than what Naomi Klein has to offer. And she's constantly like online during COVID being like, I am the other Naomi. And people kept saying things like thoughts and prayers for Naomi Klein. Like it's just like an awful thing to be mixed up with this other woman. And so my novel is like following this kind of like former housewife who's a realtor in Milwaukee, going through divorce and having been publicly shamed. And I thought she could be like Naomi Wolf, because Naomi Wolf had kind of a very public shaming experience where she got sort of outed for bad research on her book in like 2019. And then COVID happened. And so Naomi Klein's analysis of her meltdown was like narcissism plus social media plus public shaming equals right-wing meltdown. And I'm like, that's exactly what happened. But it's also happening globally. Like, it's happening to lots of people because we have a mirror world happening. And the left is just as guilty as the right in this, in the sense that there are things that they are refusing to look at. And in Doppelganger, Naomi Klein is trying to sort of see her shadow in Naomi Wolf and see the things that she's missing. I personally don't think she goes far enough, but I think it's a really great concept for like, you know, what we're coping with right now, which is like two worlds that exist side by side with completely opposite takes on things, but are at the same time using the same language. It's a huge mindfuck. But I'm sort of like, okay, my analysis is that we all have a lot of shadow work to do, all of us individually, collectively. And so this is a quote from Doppelganger. Mostly white suburban moms, done being dismissed and mocked as Karens by mean liberals, are the path to the next right-wing resurgence. Last time Bannon railed against Wall Street and the globalists who had fleeced the everyman. Now he rails against that, plus big pharma, big tech, and woke capitalism, all of which are tormenting the every mom. Bannon has cast Naomi Wolf as a kind of mom-in-chief for the voting bloc he's hoping to secure, as one-time famous feminist who wants to speak to the manager on all our behalf. So this is sort of the character that I'm like delving into now. These are storyboards that I worked on. I started teaching storyboarding, and one of the things I like doing when I teach a new class is to actually learn how to do the thing I'm teaching. Seems helpful. So I made like all of these storyboards from my novel to see like, it was unbelievably helpful, but it's also like, oh, this part's going too fast. This part needs more like explication, or what does this part mean? And maybe these images, there's too many talking heads, and maybe I need to get out of it and get out of the space of these two women and get into the world a bit. So it's been really helpful to do this, and I created from it some test animations, which I'll show you. This is just like, I reso printed some of the storyboards and then put them into Procreate and just sort of experimented with animating, but it's not, you know, it's far from realized. It's just sort of preliminary tests. And then with Chris, I made a little animatic that sort of gives it a tonal, like the tone I want it to have, which is this kind of like noir, Milwaukee noir, abject kind of vibe. And sort of ghostly and haunted. I want it to feel like almost like Milwaukee's haunted, this character's haunted. And yeah. I mean, I also don't want everything to be a joke. You know, it's like we're in a really hard time right now. So like I want us to be able to like grieve and feel badly about things and try to move through them, because I think grief is really important to process at this moment. Yeah. All right, so that's that one. But yeah, so that's it. That's my talk. Yeah, hope it was helpful.
We have time for questions. Anyone wants to ask? Bill has a microphone.
Your coaching. I'm curious how animation affected your process when it came to writing, or vice versa with writing and animation.
Good question. I think I started writing in a very different mode than I'm writing now, and I think actually animating helped ground my voice a bit more. So I think I was very intent on creating almost like caricatures to begin with. And I think the animation, when you're dealing with images and taking them into your body, you're like, oh, this has more gravitas, or this is more complicated than I thought. So it affected the writing. And so when I would go back to the writing, I'd be like, I need to slow down. It affected my pacing a bit. And so they sort of are feeding off each other now. Like the writing is sort of telling what the images to do, and the images tell the writing what to do. But generally speaking, I think the image making with animation and learning about pacing, because my stuff was so fast, it's like a pile up of images and a pile up of stuff, that I realized, like, as I'm making this, I'm like, I really want to slow down. Like, that's my next goal, is to just like be quiet and not be so busy, because I think I was avoiding stuff with the busyness. So.
I think I have a question.
Sure.
If you could talk a little bit about the role of humor in your work, and also if that's something that gets storyboarded in the same way,
Yeah.
or if it's iterative, or if you know it, like, how do you know when you've hit the right tone?
Sometimes it's a good question. Well, if it makes me laugh, I'm like, oh, that's funny. It's going to be funny. But sometimes I can't see when something's funny. Like, and this is why it's nice to show your work to people and have audiences like crack up in the middle of it, because you're like, oh, it's funny. Good. I think I have a funny hand because I have a very unskilled hand. So I sort of have a messy hand. And it can be elegant. Like, I think like my painting persona is very different than my animation person. Like, and I'm like thinking of creating avatars. Like, we have a friend who has 5 different personalities that she makes her art with. And I'm like, oh, I could do that. I could have Laura as the more elegant, sort of removed painter, you know, or I could have like the crass and vulgar New Jersey Laura, and then make work out of that. So I think, yeah, I think humor has been. Were you asking about like the role of it, or like how I know something's funny, or I forgot the rest of the question? Both, yeah.
Also, how right, if it's workshop the same way that like you with your storyboarding, if that's
Right.
how you approach it, basically.
Well, I didn't used to storyboard until recently. Storyboarding just came into my practice recently, and only because I was teaching, and I was like, I better learn how to do this. And I was also learning how to make films. So not only was I becoming an animator, I was also becoming a filmmaker, and realized I wasn't really creating cinematic space. But I think the way humor was functioning before was like protective almost, but also like to make the bad medicine go down. It was sort of softens people, it tenderizes them, and so they don't see it coming when something serious happens. And they're more receptive to it, which is a little bit cruel. But it's also like, I think, necessary to take in something that's heavy. You know, to be kind also. It's like, this is palatable because it's funny, you know, and sad. Yeah.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Judy.
Enjoyed your
Thanks for
presentation.
coming.
I thought it was interesting. One of the comments you made was at one point you were using a technique using multiple layers of glass, and you were doing it to sort of avoid being, you said having mastery.
Yeah.
And I know that for some people when they create art, sort of true in my life, the art that I do is the one tiny area in my life where I do have control.
Yeah.
And I feel like the rest of, like my house and everything is really kind of disorganized, and I have really lacking priorities. But I thought it was interesting, a way of approaching things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, mainly I did have a more perfectionist attitude around painting when I first started making work. And for like 20 years, I really tried hard to become a good painter. Like, I took it really seriously, and I learned the craft of painting. But it made me not a very good artist. Like, it wasn't good for my, it's not that it was bad for my art. Like, I think it was fine. I just think it wasn't really allowing me to say certain things because I was being too controlled. So, and because my nature is actually the opposite of yours, where I'm overly controlling, I need to loosen. I mean, I need things that open me up. Yeah.
I'm really interested in the spaces that you're making, and you have a kind of narrative approach to making a space, but at times it feels other than cinematic, and I suspect that comes out of your painting practice, but I just wonder how you think about it when you're putting the space, like in the film that we just watched, the spaces are constantly transforming and moving, and they feel really slippery, and there's doubling that happens, and it sounds like a lot of that is discovered through the process, but I just wonder if you could speak about that.
Yeah. I don't think I'm that in control of it. And that's the other thing is like, I know the kind of space I want, or like when I'm painting, I know what kind of space I want it to feel like. I want it to feel like flat, but also somehow deep at the same time. So I think I do want that for film space, but that's not really necessarily what film space is doing. like in normal films, like, you know. And so I think I was trying to do both, which is to create a cinematic space and also a painted space at the same time, and maybe it's just too tall of an order, but I do think it's really interesting when filmmakers like flatten things and create depth at the same, animators particularly, like Acid Rain. You've seen Acid Rain, right? So it's like really flat and really deep at the same time, and yet you're still in a film, and it's amazing. So it just like it adds a whole layer of like epicness to the work because you can't quite figure out the space in the same way.
I think earlier you said that you were reading Cruel Optimism, right? And I was seeing for Lance there, and what you said about mastery and some of the stuff you talked about earlier today about things dissolving, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you read in Cruel Optimism and how that shaped some of what you do in making things like Limits of Vision.
Yeah. Well, I think I was thinking a lot recently about what art has meant to me and what painting has meant to me, and I think a lot of it has been about class and wishing to sort of transcend class or to somehow like escape elements of class that have made me feel very oppressed or sad or limited, or and realizing that I kind of didn't make it or I didn't quite achieve that. Like I'm a messy artist. You know, I remember like a curator, a really good curator, this guy Mario Diacono, being like, "You're messy," and I'm like, "Yes, I am. I have failed," and sort of like giving up this aspiration of like I'm gonna be the best or I'm gonna be the da 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 or I'm gonna, because it just, I don't know. It felt like, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't gonna happen, first of all, and like why not just embrace. It seems like, I'm trying to think of a way to put this. I don't want to live in a competitive way. Like I don't, it feels unhealthy. Like I just want to make my work, you know, I'm like trying to make spaces and things that I want to connect to in a very deep way. And I don't want to feel like I'm at the same time failing to like meet others' expectations of where I am in a system that feels like it's doomed for me, you know. And I think a lot of my work is also dealing with class and like this, like how class operates in every element of our lives, and like how there's always sort of a garbage can. And I have often felt like I was the garbage can, and I don't like that feeling. So I think not, like Marcia, for example, I think has to stop attaching to her this idea of herself as like this perfect housewife, or even the idea of being a woman, of like a perfect feminine like thing. Like I was like, yeah, I definitely failed at that. And now I'm glad I failed at it. I'm like, thank God, like this sucks. And I'm just interested in not torturing myself, you know? So I like that book a lot because it's like the idea of things going to make you happy, this thing is going to make you happy, and then it makes you miserable. And you know, I've also had to question myself with making art too, because I'm like, does this make me happy or does it make me crazy? So I ask that all the time, like, could I give this up and just be like making food, for example, and taking walks in nature and not trying to say something? I mean, I would even give that up at some point if I have to. Like, I really don't want to be miserable.
I've been forced to ask a question. And I do want to thank you. You put my name up on there. I hope that wasn't gratuitous.
It wasn't gratuitous. You're like a huge, like, I show your work every semester. I'm always like, this guy's genius. Yeah.
I love Nina, where is it? Nina Serena.
Nina Serena, yeah.
Work. And I'm just wondering what you find. I show it in the social history of animation class that I teach, and very few people mention her. I'm just wondering what it is you find about her work. She's
so abject and pathetic. It's like she's given up before she even begins. Like, and I really respond to that. I like that. I think my work is about the abject a lot. So it's sort of like, why bother? And yet she's bothering. So, yeah, I like her work very much. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all
so
for
much.
coming. Laura, thank you.
Thank you. This is really fun. Thanks.